This hearing will come to order, and I would like to welcome everyone to today's Joint Economic Committee hearing titled Rebuilding the American Dream, Policy Approaches to Increasing the Supply of Affordable Housing. Today's hearing will begin with 5-minute opening statements from myself, from Vice Chairman Schweikert, and each of our 4 witnesses. We will then proceed to questions alternating between parties in the order of member arrival. Members are reminded to please keep their questions to no more than 5 minutes. And now for opening statements. There is a serious housing crisis in New Mexico and really all across this country, impacting people at all income levels in nearly every community. Whether they rent or own and whether they live in rural, suburban, or urban areas, too many Americans cannot securely afford the place they call home. Broad access to affordable, stable, and safe housing helps ensure Americans' economic well-being and social mobility. But the current housing shortage means the American dream of home ownership is out of reach for far too many. After the housing market collapse of 2008, new housing supply never recovered to keep up with demand, and the pandemic only compounded this crisis. Exclusionary zoning adds to this problem, placing restrictions on where people can live and the types of housing they can live in, often enmeshed with discriminatory practices that have left a legacy of unequal opportunity. At the same time, rents have been climbing over the past decade, and many lower-income families are being priced out of their current neighborhoods. These same families are blocked from renting in higher-income neighborhoods due to the absence of smaller, more affordable housing options. The Biden administration has taken historic steps to keep people in their homes and to increase housing production. They helped reduce the burden of housing costs during the pandemic, increased the supply of quality housing through their Housing Supply Action Plan, and took important steps to protect renters. The American Rescue Plan's state and local fiscal recovery funds also help stimulate affordable housing construction and support housing stability. But more federal investment is needed to address the growing housing crisis and ensure fair and competitive markets for renters and homeowners. We need to increase the supply of safe, accessible, and affordable homes. We need to lower rental costs and expand affordable home ownership so that families can build wealth and live safely in their communities. The low-income housing tax credit is one way that federal and state governments can help finance new building projects with affordable rental units. But that program is oversubscribed and in need of reform to make sure it reaches those most in need. The Bipartisan Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act would increase the number of available credits to better meet demand while changing program rules to make sure that more units are built to serve tribal communities, rural areas, and other underserved groups. I am a co-sponsor and strong supporter of this legislation. And in June, I introduced the Delivering Essential Protection, Opportunity, and Security for Tenants Act, also known as the Deposit Act. This legislation would help low-income renters overcome the barrier of security deposit payments when moving into new housing. This legislation has also been introduced in the House, and we can also take note of state and local programs that have produced successful results. In my home state of New Mexico, local governments are leading efforts to finance additional affordable housing stock. This past November, voters in Santa Fe approved a tax on home purchases that are over $1 million to increase revenue for the city's Affordable Housing Trust Fund. And in Las Cruces, voters approved the issuance of a $6 million general obligation bond to fund its Affordable Housing Trust Fund. This initial investment could help leverage more than $36 million in funding from state, federal, and private sources to create additional affordable housing units. These are important steps, but we need to do more at every level of government to meet the scale of this crisis. I'm looking forward to hearing from our witnesses today on how we can replicate policies that work and help create new approaches that will increase the quantity of available affordable housing and promote fair and competitive markets for both renters and homeowners. Now I will turn it over to the Vice Chairman.
Thank you, Chairman Heinrich. And thank you for choosing this one. It's something I think all of us are interested in. One of the great discussions we're going to have, and I'm going to expect this from our witnesses, is this a financing issue? Or is it actually, in many ways, a supply of buildable opportunities, whether it be taking down a former Motel 6 in parts of California where the neighbors shut it down, or things that have happened, the famous story of in Berkeley, one of the most progressive communities in America, not allowing affordable housing, as neighbors, to even right here down the street here in Virginia, where the neighborhood, a very progressive voting one, basically opposed. For those of us in the West, we actually have lots of federal land, but also state trust land, others. How much of that should be made available for future housing stock? And then there's the derivative of this, is what could we design in rules and regulations, particularly in a modernization of housing codes, construction codes, even into housing design, that would update in a way to make more affordable, but also the timeline. In many of our communities, particularly for myself in Maricopa County, one of the biggest counties in America, you want to build a housing, even if you have the land, it can take a couple years just to get your entitlements. That is not something we're going to manage from the federal government. But maybe there's some ways we can incentivize a much more one-stop process. Cities of Scottsdale and others had tried to build a model where come in, it's one desk, one counter, one filing, and you do it on one form to cut down, because the cost of holding that money, being someone who is in this business, sometimes we would acquire a piece of land, and if you held it for 3 years before you got your entitlement, what did you have to make the pricing of the housing just because of your legal, engineering, and financing costs? So, Mr. Chairman, thank you for the hearing, but I look forward to an honest assessment, other than just subsidies coming from the federal government. What do we do to help our brothers and sisters in the next generation of homeownership to develop the American dream? And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Vice Chairman. Now I'd like to introduce our four distinguished witnesses. Ms. Jen Lopez is an affordable housing consultant and the founder and president of Project Moxie, an organization committed to the development of Western regions in the U.S. She currently serves as board president for the Community Economic Defense Project and was previously a board member at the Colorado Housing Finance Authority. Prior to founding Project Moxie, Ms. Lopez led regional housing efforts in Southwest Colorado and served as the state's first cabinet-level director of homeless initiatives for then-Governor John Hickenlooper. Dr. Jenny Schutz is a senior fellow at Brookings Metro, a non-resident senior fellow at George Washington's University's Center for Washington Area Studies, and an adjunct lecturer in Georgetown's urban planning program. Dr. Schutz previously served as a principal economist at the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System, an assistant professor at the University of Southern California, and a postdoctoral fellow at NYU Furman. Mr. Tobias Peter is a senior fellow and co-director of the American Enterprise Institute's Housing Center. Prior to this role, Mr. Peter served as a director of research and research analysis for the Institute. Dr. Salim Firth is a senior fellow, research fellow, and director of the Urbanity Project at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. Dr. Firth also worked at the Heritage Foundation as an assistant visiting professor at Amherst College and as a contractor for the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Ms. Lopez, we'll start with your testimony, and then we'll go down in the order of introductions. Welcome.
Thank you, Chair Heinrich and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Jen Lopez, and I'm president of Project Moxie, a consulting firm that helps nonprofits, governments, and private sector partners acquire, preserve, and build affordable housing. I will be focusing on my work in the Southwest and will conclude with policy considerations. My experience in New Mexico began in 1997 as a graduate student at UNM, followed by my first job as a housing planner in Santa Fe. Over the past 2 decades, housing development in the Southwest has fallen behind the growing needs of families. Building activity slowed significantly after the Great Recession to 10% over the last decade, a notable decline from the 30% average since the 1970s. Factors contributing to the slowdown include builder and lender reluctance due to market conditions, a chronic labor shortage in the construction industry, and a shift in the housing industry towards catering to higher income households. This imbalance is reflected in a 70% increase in rent in New Mexico since 2017, while wages have only grown by 15%. As market rate development has slowed, our industry's efforts to address supply at the local level have met with various obstacles. Throughout the Southwest, local land use policies pose significant obstacles to increasing our housing supply. For example, in Santa Fe, the Ancorum Health Foundation spearheaded the redevelopment of a motel in late spring of 2021. We are still awaiting final approvals from the local land use department. This situation is not unique. In fact, Albuquerque, New Mexico recently initiated Housing Forward Albuquerque, aiming to allocate resources for the redevelopment of commercial properties while also eliminating land use barriers for affordable housing development. The competition within the private market for scarce resources and a shift towards higher-end real estate products limits our ability to compete in the market to generate or maintain a supply of affordable housing. This challenge is particularly pronounced in northern New Mexico, where private developers are acquiring real estate and reducing sites for affordable projects. Moreover, preserving existing housing becomes impossible when competing against private investors when our communities lack sufficient funding. In the past year, a collaborative effort, including representatives from the New Mexico delegation, worked diligently to safeguard a USDA-funded rental community named La Vista del Rio. This is in Española. Due to the structure of the USDA program, the property owner was permitted to sell this community to private investors without incurring penalties. This marked the second instance of a USDA property being sold to investors, displacing over 100 households and a permanent loss of 145 affordable units. Access to tax credits and federal funding would have facilitated preservation and redevelopment of these properties. The challenge lies in the insufficient availability of federal funds, posing a significant obstacle to scaling affordable supply to meet the needs of tens of thousands of cost-burdened New Mexicans. The stark reality is that if the market cannot provide affordable housing in New Mexico, renowned for its lower building costs, then accomplishing this feat anywhere is unlikely. In 2023, the New Mexico Mortgage Finance Authority, as the state allocating agency, financed 1,415 new affordable rental units. At this current rate, we are meeting less than 1% of the need. Since 2018, Marianne Chavez Lopez, the local housing authority director in Socorro, has tirelessly lobbied for resources for a 30-unit project and submitted multiple applications for tax credits. Further delays ensued when gap funding was inadequate. Finally, the project closed in financing last month, and it's set open to open in 2025, but it's taken 8 years to get to that point. Our industry knows how to increase housing supply, but we cannot be successful without increasing federal resources and land use reform at the local level. I'd like to pivot to some promising policy work in Colorado. In 2021, Colorado passed HB 21-1271, providing grants to local governments willing to remove land use barriers to affordable housing. Another example is Colorado's Proposition 123, a voter referendum that established a $300 million housing trust fund that provides flexible funds complementing existing federal dollars. For a local community to access funds, they must commit to increasing their housing stock by 9% and implement fast-track approvals. This incentive-based approach has changed land use reform conversations throughout Colorado. In summary, our industry can swiftly scale our efforts. However, we need the federal government to significantly increase federal resources and consider ways to support local land use reform. I urge you to consider pairing these two practices to bolster the economy. When we provide affordable housing, we house our local workforce, create jobs, and stabilize our communities. On behalf of our New Mexico and Colorado communities, we appreciate your consideration of.
Dr. Schutz?
Chair Heinrich, Vice Chair Schweikert, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to be here today. My name is Jenny Schutz. I'm a senior fellow at Brookings Metro. U.S. housing markets currently face 4 major challenges. First, the U.S. is experiencing a persistent and widespread housing shortage. Over the past several decades, housing supply has become less responsive to changes in demand. Population and job growth have not led to proportional growth in the number of homes, while prices and rents have increased faster than household incomes. Researchers estimate a shortage of nearly 4 million homes nationwide. Second, the stock of existing homes is aging and needs substantial renovation to remain safe and habitable. As the number of older adults increases, there is a growing need to retrofit existing homes with accessibility features. Many older homes were not built to withstand current and future climate stresses. Third, low-income households cannot afford market-rate housing without financial support. The poorest 20% of households spend more than half their income on housing, leaving too little cash to pay for food and other necessities. In 2023, more than 650,000 people were experiencing homelessness. Finally, the combination of high housing prices and high mortgage rates are making it difficult for renter households to purchase their first home. The situation is particularly acute for younger adults because they earn lower wages and have had less time to accumulate savings. Tight housing supply and rising costs are not just a problem for impacted families. Building too few homes makes it harder for employers to attract and retain workers. Poor quality or unstable housing harms families' physical and mental health, especially for children. Relaxing overly strict regulations could increase housing supply and improve affordability. America's housing shortage is not simply the result of market forces. Local governments across the U.S. have adopted policies that make it difficult to build more homes where people want to live. These laws have become more complex and restrictive over time, especially in high-opportunity communities. Single-family exclusive zoning is one of the most common practices. More than 3/4 of land in U.S. cities and suburbs is reserved exclusively for single-family detached homes, meaning that row houses, duplexes, and apartment buildings of all sizes are simply illegal to build. This rule creates challenges both for affordability and for expanding housing supply. Single-family homes with yards require more land per home than other structures, and therefore are more expensive to rent or buy. Additionally, many low-density communities that were developed in previous decades are now built out under their current zoning. They have no remaining undeveloped land. Rules such as large minimum lot sizes are especially problematic for the construction of small starter homes that accommodated first-time homebuyers in previous generations. Limitations on manufactured and modular housing are particularly relevant in rural areas where these homes have traditionally been an important source of moderately priced housing. The past several years have seen an unprecedented amount of housing policy experimentation, often with bipartisan support. Cities including Albuquerque, Minneapolis, and Raleigh have passed reforms aimed at legalizing missing middle housing types. State legislators from Massachusetts to Montana to Utah have passed statewide laws aimed at increasing the diversity of housing options. The federal government could support healthier housing markets through 4 channels. First, HUD should coordinate and disseminate research on effective policy solutions, such as evaluating the outcomes of recent state and local zoning efforts. Second, HUD should leverage relationships with other federal agencies and the real estate industry to monitor real-time data on the health of U.S. housing markets. Third, HUD can encourage regional collaboration among housing authorities to preserve and expand affordable housing where it is most needed. Fourth, HUD should build up its triage and rapid response capacity to be better prepared for the next housing crisis. Housing affordability has become increasingly urgent for many Americans over the past decade. Cities and states across the U.S. are experimenting with policy reforms to increase housing supply and create more diverse options. The federal government can better support the work of state and local partners, as well as the real estate industry, through strategically targeted efforts. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Chair Heinrich and Vice Chair Schweikert and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. Housing affordability issues are real for many Americans. In this election year, Congress is feeling the urge to increase the supply of affordable housing. Before taking any action, though, it should first consider a couple misconceptions. Misconception number 1, the housing supply shortage is a market failure. Not true. It is rather a government regulatory failure. Actions of all levels of government, from the implementation of restrictive zoning laws, the introduction of discretionary reviews in planning, and the rise of environmental laws and other regulations have made land scarce and home building expensive. This has restricted private developers from building enough housing to keep up with demand. As a result, today's housing shortage is estimated to be in the millions. Misconception number 2, the federal government can fix or at least ameliorate this shortage. Again, not true. The federal government has a poor track record in housing supply interventions. For example, the low-income housing tax credit, LIHTC, established in 1986 to combat the lack of affordable housing, has done next to nothing to increase the supply of housing. According to one study, almost all LIHTC development would have been built by private developer without any subsidies. If that's not enough, LIHTC also limits social mobility, and the program is corruption-prone and complex, thus crowding out many smaller builders. Misconception number 3. The only way to add affordable housing is through subsidies and government programs. Not true. The root cause is government regulatory failure, and no amount of money can fix that. The literature is clear that the most effective way to add affordable housing is to build a lot of market rate housing, which helps tamp down home price and rent appreciation. As new market rate housing is built, higher income households will move into these new units, freeing up their now vacant lower priced unit. This process, known as filtering, repeats itself further down the price ladder, as commonly seen in the new and used car market. The true policy solution lies in zoning and land use reform at the state and local level. Such reforms would unleash the market forces to provide hundreds of thousands of new units without subsidies each year. Misconception 4. Institutional investors, junk fees, rent pricing algorithms, Airbnb, foreign buyers, or vacant homes are responsible for widespread housing unaffordability. Not true. While these entities make easy scapegoats, they are at best symptoms of the supply-demand imbalance, not the root cause. Misconception 5. Government can make housing affordable through various demand subsidies, such as looser lending policies, lower mortgage premium, or down payment assistance. Again, not true. Such practices increase demand against severely limited supply. This benefits those that own homes or the select few that receive the subsidy, but it raises housing costs for all. Having dispelled these misconceptions, the solution to today's housing shortage becomes clear. First, the federal government needs to stay out. Congress is considering expanding the LIHTC program and creating the middle-income housing tax credit, which would expand LIHTC to middle-income households. Such a massive expansion of the state would ultimately waste taxpayer money, crowd out more private builders, and worst of all, it would do precious little to address the nation's housing supply shortage. It would also be bad policy for Congress or the administration to expand lending subsidies that would raise the cost of housing for all. Second, zoning and land use policies are state and local issues and need to be tackled at these levels of government. Numerous case studies from around the country have shown that the formula for successful housing reforms is simple. Roll back government regulatory failures by allowing greater density in lots of areas and make the rules simple and the process by right. These actions will unleash the ingenuity of the American people by allowing builders of all sizes to build abundant market rate housing over time. Fortunately, this is already happening and entirely without federal involvement. In 2023, Washington, Montana, Vermont followed Oregon and California in passing statewide reforms that allow moderate higher density in the form of cost-effective ADUs, duplexes, triplexes, and townhouses. The federal government could amplify this trend by auctioning off underutilized federal land without any strings attached for private market rate developers. As Senator Lee has pointed out, there are plenty of opportunities, particularly out west. More land means more building, which will translate into more filtering and greater housing affordability. On the other hand, federal involvement to influence or even speed up state and local reform movements would result in complex, one-size-fits-all solutions that would therefore perpetuate the housing supply problem. To be clear, housing unaffordability is a self-inflicted wound stemming from a government regulatory failure. Supply reform requires no taxpayer subsidies, and if properly implemented, they have shown to work. If more states and cities sign on, such reforms could provide hundreds of thousands of new homes each year, which would allow more Americans, even those of lesser means, to access their own American dream. Thank you.
Dr. Firth.
Good afternoon, Chairman Heinrich, Vice Chairman Schweikert, and committee members. Thank you for the opportunity to address you today. My name is Salim Firth, and I'm a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, where I am co-director of the Urbanity Project. Today, I offer a snapshot of housing affordability trends and then detail how state legislatures are aggressively tackling the long-term causes of high prices. But much work remains to be done. It's a difficult era for renters. From 2000 to 2011, the share of income spent on rent rose from 25% to 31%, and it has remained high since. Home buyers are in better shape. As of 2022, the average brand new homeowner household spent less than 22% of its income on housing costs. Of course, the national trends conceal large, growing differences across regions. Home prices in the most expensive states are about 3.8 times higher than in the least expensive. Pandemic-era preferences and policies contributed to a sharp increase in home prices and rents. The most important is that we spend more time at home. During COVID, roommates split up, families carved out home offices, and parents opted to homeschool. The increase in demand for residential space appears to be permanent, so people will spend more on housing going forward. The second recent shock was the sequence of interest rate movements. Mortgage rates tanked in 2020 and then spiked in 2022. Low rates allowed sellers to raise prices, and homeowners like me refinanced. But when interest rates spiked, it did not have an equal and opposite effect on prices. The low rates became golden handcuffs. The resulting lack of inventory for sale has kept prices high. And finally, housing was not exempt from economy-wide inflation, which has amounted to about 16% since January 2020. As valuable as it is to understand recent fluctuations, long-term trends are even more important. To understand why, let's compare the Los Angeles and Oklahoma City metro areas. Home prices in both cities are about 40% higher today than in January 2020. That increase, however, was added to a base price of $683,000 in LA, but just $162,000 in OKC. As a result, the 4-year increase alone amounts to 3 median household incomes in LA, but just 1 in OKC. So what explains the 4-fold difference in baseline prices? Economists believe that the biggest factor is that OKC has allowed enough housing to be built to meet demand, while LA has not. As a result, material living standards are higher in OKC, even though nominal income is lower. The scarcity of housing in restrictive, high-wage cities has deepened every decade. Through most of American history, large numbers of people have migrated from low to high-wage places. No more. Now, Americans move to cities with attainable modern housing. Now the good news. State legislatures have taken seriously the role of local regulation and begun the long road to reform. California's efforts have received the most press, but some other states have gone further. In both Vermont and Montana, the governor and key legislators made zoning reform a top priority. Local newspapers and organizations led a public conversation about the reach of zoning. The legislative leaders convened stakeholders, formally in Montana, informally in Vermont, and hashed out consensus reforms to make it significantly easier to build housing. For example, both states now allow duplexes everywhere in most towns, and both created new exemptions from state environmental review. In both states, these ambitious, extensive limitations of local regulatory authority received supermajority support from legislators in both parties. And in both states, lawmakers are not done. They have promised to continue reforms in their upcoming session. Important strides have been made in many other states, including Oregon, Rhode Island, Utah, Washington, and Wisconsin. In several other states, including Arizona and Colorado, reform efforts fell just short in 2023 because legislators, in both parties, were hesitant to limit city power. Unlike many issues, this one cuts across lines. Legislators from both sides recognize the need for more housing, and legislators from both sides would prefer not to preempt local governments. For 50 years, the pendulum has swung too far toward local authority to restrict housing construction. State legislators are now moving back toward balance, restoring the individual freedom to build, and, we hope, durably increasing the supply of housing. Thank you.
Thank you all. I am a little bit struck by the fact that there are a number of disagreements here on how to move forward, but I think I heard all of you say that reforming exclusionary zoning is going to be key to solving this crisis. Do any of you disagree with that? We'll just go down the line here. We'll start with Dr. Firth and go across to Ms. Lopez. Tell me what you think is most effective to incentivize that. And you're talking to someone who used to be the land use chair of a city council. So I know how contentious zoning changes can be. Liquor licenses, zoning changes, it gets very sporty in those council meetings. So how can we incentivize this given the fact that all of you seem to agree that this reform is a key driver of how we address this crisis? Dr. Firth.
Thank you. I think that's best done at the state level, and that's going to be a mix of preemption, where you simply say, there are things that should be allowed everywhere. For instance, there's no reason any city should be spending its time calculating parking spaces for developers. They can figure that out on their own. Let's just get the cities out of that business. Then there's other things where you say, hey, every city should have at least some zoning for multifamily housing. Maybe it doesn't need to be everywhere in the jurisdiction. Maybe we want to keep commercial and multifamily separate. But at a minimum, there should be a place, and Vermont actually has passed this into law. There's got to be a place in your town that allows for multifamily housing. Then there's a mix of state incentives there.
Gotcha.
I don't think the federal government has great tools for this.
Mr. Peter.
Yeah, I agree with Salim. I mean, this is best done at the state and local level. Probably at the state level is best. What we found in our research is that framing really matters at the local level. And of course, the NIMBYs are a group that need to be overcome. But if you frame the issue properly, we have found that removing exclusionary zoning has been successful in California, past reform, Washington, Oregon, Vermont, Montana, and the list goes on and on. But if you frame it around where your kids and grandkids going to live, that seems to have impact, because older Americans are now realizing their kids, if they move across country where they can afford a home, but if they're only going to see them once or twice per year, that's a real downside. So that the framing is very important. And at the same time, what we found is that the incentives are really aligned here. You can pull in a lot of groups that would benefit from it. Just to name a few: builders, realtors, bankers, more homes to build, mortgages to originate, loans to sell. It's good for the environment because you're replacing.
I'm going to
some
run
older
out of
homes.
time, so I'm going to keep going down the dais here. Dr. Schutz.
I think it's helpful to think of localities in kind of two different buckets. There's a bucket of localities that don't want to change their zoning. They like it the way it is. The voters are not going to get on board. And so those are going to be the really hard places to change. But there are actually a substantial number of local governments that know housing supply is a problem. They know that affordability is an issue voters care about. They want to do better, but they don't know exactly what to do. If you look at the list of zoning rules, figuring out which ones do you need to change to make it more effective to build, what are the kinds of structures that developers want to build in your community but can't, and how do you get them there? Gotcha. That's not always an obvious question. So I think one of the things actually the federal government is best suited to do is start doing some evaluation of the reforms that we're seeing, understand what kinds of policy changes are helpful in particular kinds of markets, and then provide that information to local governments that want to do better and just need the information. The other thing that local governments are struggling with is how to do community engagement in a way that doesn't privilege the voices of a few NIMBYs over often a very broad swath of people, including business interests, who would really like to have more housing. And that's, again, something localities are starting to experiment with surveys and polls that tap into a much wider range of voters. Figuring out how to do that, and again, helping local governments do that better, is something we could definitely do.
Great. Ms. Lopez.
We've been talking about this since the 90s or even earlier, and at UNM we had a lot of conversations about this, but I finally have hope. The reason I have hope is that we're seeing some action in Colorado, and I think New Mexico is interested in following suit. And what's getting people excited about actually changing things is incentives. So the state is going to fund housing. It does. It always has. And so adding the incentives of if you do these things, you get access to infrastructure money. Infrastructure is huge right now, right? We have old and aging infrastructure, and then we have areas that are growing that just can't afford to do it. So we're tying it to infrastructure. In Prop 123, we're tying it to just new pots of money, very exciting pots of money, workforce housing, homeless money. And we're saying, look, we're not going to prescribe how you do this. We're going to tell you what the goal is. It's outcome driven. We want you to increase your base number of units, and then I think what's really important is local communities need technical assistance. They're already overburdened. So if we can create best practices, I love collecting them, and then help them implement, I think you get a long way there. So we're very excited about what's happening.
Great. Thank you all. Vice Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was just sort of looking up how many, being from Maricopa County, I accept it's a very large county, but we get 100,000 new residents a year, 300 plus a day. And first off, there's both the demographic migration issue. What happens when you drive through parts of rural Kansas and it's been depopulated, and come to the Phoenix Scottsdale area and, you have bidding wars on homes as people are moving from California and those things. So I want to make sure we're all being intellectually honest here. It's a housing stock issue, but it's also a housing stock issue in regards to where there's jobs and people are choosing to live. And that's not going to be taken care of through a financing mechanism. It's going to become, actually, those are desirable areas as long as they have housing stock that's affordable. I do have a couple unusual questions, just because one's front of mind. Do any of you have a specialty in sort of taxation and housing? Because we've had a running debate, and I'll just jump on
Yeah,
this one because we've been talking about, before getting elected, I actually ran some partnerships that bought lots of houses. And we've had a running discussion with some of our tax people, being on Ways and Means. Here's the tax benefits you get as a homeowner. You get to deduct your interest, you get the once in a lifetime, per person, those things. But if I'm a corporate entity, LLC, partnership, I get to component depreciate. I get to have a 1031 exchange and those things. Have any of you ever seen a study where there's been actually a parity discussion on tax benefits compared to being the individual, compared to being a corporate entity? And it's a little ethereal, and if not, I'm going to turn to my chairman here and say, why don't we try something bipartisan with our brilliant staff? Mm-hmm. Maybe we could get the Democrat and Republican staffs to assign someone, saying, take a run at this. It's an interesting question, and I've never actually seen it other than the numbers we've been trying to do. Questions? And this is, let's do the same thing. Let's go from Ms. Lopez down the line. Give me something that's been successful at a community level, preferably, in my case, unlike someone who has more rural America, well, you have rural, suburban. Myself, I'm all urban. That's been successful incentivizing a community to update its zoning practices. What's worked? What have you seen work? Ms. Lopez.
So I just spoke about the state one. So local, I'm going to give an example from Santa Fe that goes back to the 90s, and I wish I could replicate it all the places I work in. It was sort of an incentive and more of an action. They were very proactive. So back in the 90s, the city council bought their own, a failed subdivision. And what they did is they took care of the cost of land, zoning, and infrastructure in one fell swoop. It's called Tierra Contenta. It's a best practice, and they also leverage private builders. They said, look, government, let's do what we're good at. Let's lay the foundation to make it a more market-friendly solution to housing, and then get out of the way. What happened was they built hundreds, probably 1,500 homes over the last 16, 17 years, mixed income, another best practice. We love to see folks of all incomes living in the neighborhood. So that's a package, but I think it's a really powerful one, and it illustrates how local government can be an engine and create opportunity.
Doctor.
One example at the state level that I'm watching, along with my colleague Dr. Firth, is the new program in Massachusetts that requires all localities that have a commuter rail station or a T station to allow some multifamily. And that was prompted both by the need for housing, but also things like declining ridership on transit, so you can kill two birds with one stone. We're still waiting to see how that's going to work out. And I will say the best incentive to get local governments to update their zoning is when their voters show up and say, housing is too expensive, I'd like you to do this. The places that have done this have really had pressure from the voters, pressure from constituencies, and they realize that this is something that actually can get them reelected the next time.
Thank you, Dr. Spear.
So Seattle is one example. So Seattle in the 1990s, they convened a study, and they were realizing home prices are getting out of sight, and we need to do something. So as a compromise, they set aside certain parts of the city, what they called for urban villages, where they allowed townhouses to be built instead of just single-family detached housing. And over the last 20 years, they've actually built 18,000 new townhouses. 2/3 of those are owner-occupied. They are catered towards people earning about 80 to 100%, 120% of area median income. They are being purchased by younger and more diverse group of people, and it's been a great success. It's been a great success until in 2019 they became greedy, and they thought, well, let's create an inclusionary zoning mandate where we provide a little bit more density in exchange for you to set aside a larger number for lower income people. On the rental side, it didn't make a difference, but for these townhouses where they're selling them for homeowners, the permits fell off a total cliff. And then this speaks to the best practices that the federal government, HUD actually came out and said this policy has been a great success. But in reality, they've built hundreds of units, but it cost them thousands of units. So this is a danger of getting the federal government involved.
Doctor, we're way over time, but can you give me something quick? What municipality should I look to?
Sure. Auburn, Maine is my favorite example. I got to work with the mayor there on a huge community-wide upzoning that absolutely involved elections, going out there, pitching it to the voters and saying, I have a vision of growing our community. And Maine's an aging state. And he said, when was our town great? And they all said the 60s, the 70s. He said, what we were doing then? We were growing. We were building housing units. We were adding jobs. They're trying to get back to that. Thank you.
Okay, and Mr. Chairman, thank you, very patient. Another future question will be also starting to talk about national demographics and where this fits in. Thank you.
Representative Byer.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, and thank you very much for doing this. Dr. Schutz, I live right across the river inside the Beltway. So the number one political issue in Arlington, Virginia last year was the missing middle. And it tore the community apart. People that had worked together politically for years hated each other. They ended up electing 2 members of city council, one that was for the missing middle, the other was against. Now in Alexandria this year, last year in December, I think, they eliminated single-family home zoning. No more from now on. And once again, it's likely to be the centerpiece of this coming elections this year. How do we avoid the backlash? How does this not happen in community after community all across the country, where the people that are already there and love their single-family neighborhoods and their big lawns resist, and they're often by the ones that have the most political power?
Some of this is about how the issue gets framed. And if I had a magic wand, I would actually wave it and say, nobody can say eliminate single-family zoning or end single-family zoning. Because for a lot of people, that winds up being very confusing, and they think it means make it illegal to build single-family homes, which is not what any of these policy changes do. Often the advocates want to present this as a big radical change, when really what it means is we're going to legalize building ADUs and townhomes. Arlington and Alexandria have lots of beautiful townhome neighborhoods that people love. So a lot of this is reminding people that it's in fact re-legalizing things that are already in their community, and often some of the neighborhoods that people want to live in the most and find very architecturally beautiful and very human scale. Good elected leaders will figure out the constituencies who are behind this and also manage the engagement process. Once the NIMBYs get a big microphone and start sharing their information, they can poison the debate and make it hard to put out facts. There's often a lot of disinformation that gets shared around this. But this takes strategy at the local level. The constituencies look a little bit different in smaller communities that are worried about population loss versus places that are worried about having too many people moving in.
Thank you very much. Ms. Lopez, Mr. Peter did a good job sort of blowing up a bunch of the myths. One of the myths was that he tried to explode was that LIHTC doesn't work. We now have a deal pending before the House and the Senate that would expand the child tax credit, R&D tax credit, but they added an expansion of the LIHTC, which, by the way, it typically has hundreds of Democrats and Republicans for it. Can you answer his concern that it's done nothing to improve housing over the years?
Representative Byer, I'd love to. So again, I've been working in this field for 24 years, and in my experience as a development consultant developer, being on a Housing Finance Authority advocate, in Colorado alone, the tax credit programs created 80,000 units of affordable housing. That sounds very successful to me. I don't have the New Mexico numbers, but I would suspect 20 to 30,000. And we do it very efficiently. Most state agencies are allocating around, and they're giving us points to make sure that we're building the most efficient green product we possibly can. That product's going to be affordable for 30 years. They're managing to how much developer fee can be taken from the deal. They're managing. They're making sure that we're taking some debt, so this is not all. We're leveraging private funding, both in equity and borrowing. And so it really is a public-private partnership to get those deals done. I mean, it's the most successful affordable housing development tool in the country that Reagan created. I mean, he created it, and it's how we get units on the ground. So thank you.
that Reagan heritage may be how we get Republican co-sponsors too.
I think so.
Thank you. Dr. Firth, George Mason University, very proud of that. I'm impressed with the factoid that more Americans live alone than at any time in the country's history, and a greater percentage live alone than any time in our history. During the pandemic, we saw lots of multi-generational households when it went back. How can we use this notion of these one-person households to move housing in the correct direction?
Thank you, Representative, and thanks for representing my workplace. It's a great question. This is where I think accessory dwelling units and other kinds of flexible housing can be really valuable, right? A lot of times a single-person household is a stage of life, right? It's either early adulthood or maybe after retirement. You might go through a period where you're, retired and healthy, and then you might have a period where you're retired and would really like to live next to somebody who can help you out with moving heavy boxes or checking in on you daily. A large home is not the best thing for that. In a lot of places, the single-family zoning functionally means you can't add a kitchen. That's really what it boils down to, is if you build another kitchen, you've broken the law. You can add a bathroom, you can add anything else, you can't build another kitchen. And simply saying it's not local government's job to police stoves, that is really, it really is the stove. That's where, like, if you put in the larger electrical outlet, that's when the moment you've broken the law. And simply getting government out of that business and saying, if somebody wants to break up their house and live on the first floor and let their nephew live on the top floor or rent it out, that's perfectly fine. I think that would help a lot of people.
Representative Ferguson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here. I'm going to speak to you today and ask questions from the point of view of being a former mayor of a small town. And also, as part of my past life, I was a very small home builder during that as well. When we talk about housing affordability, I want to come back to the things that we've been discussing here, but I think we should address the elephant in the room, which is the cost of housing and the rapid rise in the increase in housing that's occurred over the last couple of years. Look, we've got to do things to drive down the cost of housing. That includes driving interest rates lower. Those interest rates are being driven right now by inflation and the Fed's response to inflation. So how do we get that under control? We have got to cut back on the federal spending and the borrowing, but we've also got to increase productivity. We need to be putting in pro-growth policies that drive the supply side of our equation. I also worry deeply about the Fed's new requirements in the Basel III section that I think is going to further restrict capital. And quite candidly, we've got to do more to drive energy costs lower so that we can get back to being energy independent. Owning a house costs energy. It is part of the monthly equation, and it's something that we've got to address. Another issue that is driving up cost is the available workforce in the construction industry. While we are facing a crisis in higher education on all fronts, we should be doing more to encourage people to utilize technical schools and technical education and apprenticeships and to making all types of apprenticeships available so that we can get more folks interested in the trades that we need so desperately. And I think that's really important. I also think we've got to be thinking about how to be innovative in the use of construction materials. Specifically, one that I think makes a lot of sense is using mass timber or cross-laminated timber. I think that is something that we can build here in America, and I think making some of the green energy tax credits available for mass timber makes a lot of sense. In order to do that, we've also got to increase education awareness at our architectural institutes, but we've also have got to make sure that local communities' zoning and planning allows for this, and also we've got to make sure that the inspectors and the permitting process allows for this as well. And again, these are state and local issues, but we need to be thinking about how we can encourage that to take place. Again, I want to go back to the energy piece of it. The higher our energy costs, the less affordable a home becomes across the board. And again, I think driving down inflation, driving down interest rates, increasing workforce, and increasing the supply side will make a huge difference in the overall cost of construction. It does not matter how this body looks at the best way to fund it, whether it's through government subsidies or strictly on the private sector, there isn't enough money at the current cost, so we've got to drive those costs down. I think that's really important. I want to push back on one thing, Mr. Peter, that you said about LIHTC housing. As a former mayor, it does work, but it is not the solution. It has to be part of an overall development plan, and we should guard strongly against moving this into the middle class. Housing affordability in the middle class is a function of construction cost, interest rates, and really good-paying jobs. I find it really interesting that most of the examples that you've given are all around metropolitan areas. You've talked about Oklahoma City, you've talked about Los Angeles, you've talked about, Denver, Colorado, other areas like that. So many of our fellow Americans live in rural areas. And I think that what we've got to do is we've got to rebalance the equation, both in terms of job production and in terms of incentives to close the economic viability gap in rural America, because this place has done an amazing job of turning rural America into an inner city. I do applaud the efforts that you talk about with zoning and planning. It is a tough road to hoe, no doubt. But if you get the community on board, Dr. Firth, like you talked about, you can build something, you can change the ideology of a community, and you can begin to put things in place that make sense, that attract younger people to communities. I go back to what worked through many towns throughout the South up until NAFTA, and these were mill villages that were built around the textile industry, where you had many small houses put together in a relatively dense area, and many families lived not just for a period of time, but for generations in these houses because these communities worked. And finally, I'd like to touch on the fact that I think we ought to really make it a priority to protect agricultural land. And Mr. Chairman, I think that is something, if through local zoning and planning and through the state, I think we can protect that in economically, environmentally sensitive areas. Things like conservation easements are a really good tool. They need some reforms, but they do help protect environmentally sensitive areas. So I know I've spent a lot of time talking. I love this topic. Bottom line, so much of this has got to be done at the local level. But our job here in Congress is to make housing more affordable by ending the crushing inflation that is just crippling American families up and down the economic spectrum right now. With that, I yield back.
Representative Trone.
I thank the chairman and the staff for gathering us here today to talk about a plan to preserve and expand affordable housing. Housing is a human right. Everyone deserves a roof over their head. Yet in America, so many families struggle to afford a home. And 10 million renters, I find it unbelievable. 25% of those renters spend over 50% of their income. That's impossible to save money to buy a home. It's impossible to save money for retirement, unexpected emergencies. It puts them in an unattainable, difficult position. So Dr. Deutsch and Ms. Lopez, you both highlighted the importance of federal action. We just got some good news. The Ways and Means Committee said they hopefully have struck a bipartisan deal on the child tax credit and the low housing income tax credit. What impact will expanding that housing tax credit have on the housing market, especially for these low-income and middle-income families? Lopez first.
Thank you, Representative. What a wonderful question. This legislation that is coming about right now, immediately, it's going to create 200,000 rental homes for low-income households across the nation. This is the biggest investment we've seen in 35 years. It cannot be understated how important these units are to preventing homelessness. We've seen an incredible increase nationally to homelessness. The majority of that is a simple equation. I cannot afford my home. I'm going to be displaced. And so, again, this is going to be a game changer for our local communities, providing stability, creating housing for our local workforce, and just helping people be active citizens participating in their local communities so they can change land use. So
Doctor?
it's very important. Thank you.
I'd actually love to pick up one of the other pieces that's in the new bill, which is the expanded child tax credit. We know from some early evidence on the child tax credit from the previous year that many families with kids use that extra money to pay for the rent, to pay for their utility bills, to pay for necessities for their kids. So one of the really great things is that providing cash to people allows them to balance changes in their expenditures across time. Housing vouchers are very effective at covering the rental part, but providing people with cash through the child tax credit or the earned income tax credit allows them to balance when their expenses change from month to month. So that's fantastic.
Strongly agree. In my district, Hagerstown, Maryland, we're increasing the development of manufactured homes to boost affordable housing options. And I'm proud of the work being done there. It could be a model perhaps for other communities. Dr. Deutsch, could you talk about removing zoning restrictions on manufactured homes or mobile homes, how they can benefit rural communities?
Manufactured and mobile homes are a really important part of the affordable housing stock in rural areas and even in some urban areas that have relatively inexpensive land, places like Pittsburgh. Sometimes it's written into the zoning, sometimes it's actually a part of the building code, and sometimes there are issues with the financing because mobile homes tend to be financed differently than stick-built homes. But those are hugely important things to focus on in a lot of smaller communities, and it's great when communities start to tackle those barriers.
Ms. Lopez, take a second and talk about the importance of financial incentives. You've hit it a couple of different times, and sometimes we don't have a full agreement on that, but how do we incentivize these developers to build these low-income housing, affordable housing, versus mid to upper income housing where they think they're going to make more money? How important are these incentives?
Thank you, Representative Trone. It's incentives, and it's just the only way it's financially feasible. So I kind of want to separate those two things. When we talk about incentives, it's really local governments getting infrastructure in. Developers, they have to have profit. That's how it works, and we support that. But they cannot both deliver products if the costs are too high, interest rates are too high. When we're trying to create rental housing serving that costs $400 to $1,200 to $1,300 a month, the economics don't work. There's a gap that has to be filled. So, we fill it with tax credits. We also fill it. We have an incredible, robust system of CDFIs across this country. We fill gap all the time with lower interest rates. We have a lot of great tools at the federal government level. So I love the tax credit program, the CDFI program, but I need them all because my development partners say to me, hey, Jen, this isn't financially feasible. I'm going to go next door and do something else.
Just quickly, we're going to have a huge glut of empty office buildings throughout so many major cities. How do we pair that empty office building glut with, I was at a homeless shelter just 2 days ago. And, we've got so many hundreds of thousands of homeless. I heard the statistic a minute ago, it's mind-boggling. How do we pair that against low-income housing, homelessness, and try and figure out how to connect those two dots together? Want to take a stab at that?
I would, Representative Trone, thank you so much. This is maybe the best topic of the day. I totally agree. Something that we learned during the pandemic is when commercial spaces lost value, when we went back home to work, when motels were down, we were able to quickly pivot those properties and repurpose them. We saved lives. We created bridge programming. We are able to convert those into tax credit apartments. We had some zoning challenges, but I think one of the greatest incentives we had was the ARPA funds. If we hadn't had the creativity and the resources of the ARPA funding, there's no way that the state couldn't help us local government partners go out, acquire the property, and take a little bit of risk to repurpose these. And they are very successful. So that's another tool that I think is helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Senator Hessen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Vice Chair. I really appreciate the topic of today's hearing. And I want to start with a question to you, Dr. Schutz. According to recent estimates by the New Hampshire Housing Finance Authority, my state needs more than 23,000 housing units right now. This is in a state of 1.4 million people to address our housing shortage, and we need even more in coming decades. So I'm focused, along with a bunch of other people, on bipartisan solutions to increase our country's supply of affordable housing. Doctor, can you expand on the options available to Congress to support the construction of new housing?
So Congress has somewhat limited options on the zoning reforms that we've been talking about, but it can play a really important role in helping communities learn what kinds of policy changes work and adopt those. Ms. Lopez brought up the issue of technical assistance. That's incredibly important, particularly in a lot of places like New England where you have very small cities and towns. They have one planner, and asking that one planner to figure out what they're supposed to do and implement new innovative programs is just very difficult. Technical assistance and making guidelines accessible is one of the most useful things the federal government could do.
Well, that's excellent. I would also add that some of our local processes, it isn't necessarily just the laws or the rules, it's the processes themselves that are rooted in the 18th and 19th century, maybe could use some updating while still maintaining transparency and local control and oversight, which is also so important. So I appreciate that very much. Ms. Lopez, I want to talk to you a little bit more about the low-income housing tax credit. From my perspective, this is a key bipartisan tool for increasing the supply of housing in New Hampshire. Again, we've been talking about this in the latest bipartisan tax agreement that we have just announced the framework of. But to follow up on the answers you've already given, can you elaborate on how LIHTC helps state housing authorities finance more affordable housing units? Because I think that's a critical piece.
Thank you, Senator Hess. I'd be happy to. So again, the tax credits flow to the state agencies. The state agencies create priorities for how to award those credits. And this new credit legislation is powerful in that it not only gives us a bump, that 12% bump we need, 12.5% bump we need to get back to where we were in 2021. It also allows us, it decreases the amount of private activity bond we need to fully utilize the 4% tax credit. That's a lot of jargon to say we have a lot more rocket juice to build housing and build it quickly and build it now. So that's the power of the tax credit program and the reforms that are in place. One other comment I want to make, Section 8 is a huge, powerful tool as well. We don't have units to put our Section 8 vouchers in, so we will better deploy the existing federal resources we have. That's really powerful, so thank you.
Well, thank you for that. And one last question to Dr. Schutz again. I want to turn to the issue of rental housing that some of my colleagues have raised, because a recent academic study found that eviction threats are associated with worse health outcomes for renters. Safe, stable, and affordable housing is really essential for health and well-being. And we know that a significant number of evictions occur when a tenant owes only a couple of $100s or less. Really small differences in a lot of our rental units. To keep granted staters safely and stably housed, I've previously introduced the Prevent Evictions Act to provide grants for landlord-tenant mediation programs, which would reduce the number of small-dollar evictions, which also just create a lot of turmoil and turnover, not only for tenants, but for landlords, too. So can you discuss how ensuring stable housing can complement public health efforts?
Absolutely. Going through being evicted and the instability that that provides in a family is really devastating, especially for families with kids who are a disproportionate share of people who wind up being evicted. Things like eviction prevention programs, providing mediation, access to short-term emergency funds. Again, the emergency rental assistance during the pandemic showed us that relatively small amounts of money can help some tenants. That's not a solution for people who are perpetually behind on their rent.
Right.
So having vouchers or some sort of long-term income support matters as well. But we can save some people from being evicted for relatively little money and prevent landlords also from having to go through that.
Well, I really appreciate that, and I also appreciate the comments about the expansion of the child tax credit, because again, giving people that, we know that people spend that on essentials like rent, like food. They also, sometimes it means they have a little bit of money left over to help their kids, for instance, participate in school programs, such an important thing. So thank you all very much for your work.
Representative Arrington.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me? Yes, we are live. I think we've done a number on this economy, whether you look at the people who build the homes or those who buy or rent those units of housing. We've had the worst combination on the supply and demand side to throw this system into a bit of chaos, especially for the consumer. We've constrained supply with higher taxes and regulations. By we, I say my Democrat friends and this administration, by paying people more than they would have made in their previous job while on unemployment insurance. Now, I don't think that exists today, in fairness. Repealing work requirements, which both of which created a labor shortage. And I think once you take this employee retention credit away, you'll see that play out in a much bigger way on this economy. And then, of course, energy costs have skyrocketed on account of the energy policies of this administration. Now, I'm not mad necessarily. I'm just stating what I believe are the facts. And on the other side of the supply-demand, you've got what was $11 trillion in spending over the last few years, $6 trillion of which went to the national debt. And that's another concern and another topic for another day. But so you have a real mess. And what is our first instinct? Let's subsidize it. Let's intervene with some, blanket Washington policy. And look, I get it. There are instances probably where the tax code provides an incentive for a behavior that we either want but don't get because maybe there's a market failure, or we need to accelerate behavior because we think it's in the best interest of the public. There are times when that is appropriate. I'm worried that the tax credit for low-income housing is really treating the root causes of the high cost of low-income housing, and it's just addressing more of the symptom, and we're actually enabling some of the supply side problems at the state and local level with zoning, environmental, and other legal policy and otherwise regulatory barriers and costs and constraints, which is why I think, and I don't mean to pick on California, but I think that's why people are leaving California. They cannot afford to live in California. And I think a lot of that is self-inflicted. Now, there are policy choices, and Californians have the sovereign freedom and right to choose their path, but they have to live with the consequences. And half of the people leaving California end up in Texas, where the average price of homes, by the way, is about $280,000 less. $280,000 less. So policies have consequences. I mean, at least they do at the state and local level. And that's the interesting thing, Mr. Chairman. They have consequences at the state and local level because they have to pay for it. They have to balance their budget. What we'll do, whether this is good or bad or somewhere in between in terms of low-income housing or whatever the federal fix, we'll have our children pay for it. They'll be stuck with the bill. You saw where CBO miscalculated. They thought that the deficit last year would be $1.6 trillion. It was $2.6. They were $1 trillion off. So I like the economic, rational trade-off and dynamic that exists at the state and local level because it's real. It's not real up here. So they can decide, Texas and California and others, how best to solve this problem. I guess here's my bottom line, Mr. Chairman, on the LIHTC, for example. It may be better than other federal interventionist strategy, but I don't know that that credit is actually passed to the consumer with lower prices. I think lawyers are getting it, landowners are getting it, and I bet you there are studies, and I know I've gone way over I'm 6, 7 seconds, 8 seconds over my time, but I bet that there are studies, Dr. Firth and Mr. Peter, if the chairman will indulge me, that suggest that that money that we want, all of us want to go to the renter to have more affordable housing, which we all want, bet it doesn't really do that.
Is there a question mark in there?
That's I say that with the inflection of question mark at the end.
Mr. Peter, do you want to address that real
I
quick?
can
And then
address
As chairman, I hate when people.
I'll ask
don't
Ms.
ask the
Lopez to
question.
also address this.
Thank you, Chairman.
I'll
Appreciate it.
I'll do it real quick. So we have a huge housing supply shortage, and 4 million all the way up to 20 million, whatever study you believe. Anytime you increase demand against the limited supply, you're going to end up driving up prices or rents, and that's exactly the wrong approach that we need to do. We need to do more. We need to loosen supply restrictions so we can get our supply and demand more in balance. And in order to do this, we need state and local reform.
Ms. Lopez, do you want to address that same issue?
Sure. Thank you, Chair Heinrich. Sir, I agree with a lot of what you're saying, but I want to clarify about the tax credit program because I can. So in the many years that I've done the program, how it works, right? Once the credits are sold, we build the building. It's a regulated program. There's lots of involved parties making sure that we are serving the people we intend to serve. And how we do that is there are income certifications every single year. Every year we look at that building, who is being served and are they the right income? And the only way we can serve that income is if the rent is low. So it's a very established program, heavily regulated, very low defaults. And so I am very confident in saying that when we invest in a tax credit housing project, it's serving the people we want it to serve. So thank you.
Representative Porter.
Thank you very much. America doesn't have enough affordable housing. I think that's something actually that the witnesses generally agree on, even if we disagree on the solutions. So let me start by just making sure we all understand the scale and the magnitude of the problem. So Dr. Schutz, about how many homes do we need to solve the affordable housing shortage?
So the best estimates that we have at the moment suggest we need about 4 million total homes across the country. That's not specific to an individual income level. Those are a little bit harder to come up with.
Okay, so 4 million is kind of the minimum. Some people have gone as high as 6 and 7 million in their estimate. This is a 4 million family problem. This isn't one where we're going to just be able to tinker a little around the edges, which is one of Washington's favorite things to do. One of my questions is, we've heard about this new tax package, which I should say, I have no idea if this is actually going to pass into law. We don't yet have the support of all the leaders we'll need, in Republican or Democratic side on it. But what we're told is that this would be, and I think this is correct, the biggest investment in housing in 35 years. Is that correct, Ms. Lopez?
That is correct. Thank you, Representative.
Okay, and how this biggest investment, remember, here's the problem, 4 to 7 million families that can't afford or don't have housing. That's the size of the problem. This biggest investment in 35 years. I'm so excited. How many affordable homes would it build?
200,000.
Wait, say it again.
200,000.
200,000. So herein lies the problem. While I am grateful that my colleagues on both sides of the aisle are willing to do something, the biggest problem we have had in housing for 50 or 60 years is that folks in Washington don't do much of anything. You don't have a 4 to 7 million shortage in a year or two. You have it because we have an entire generation or two of career politicians who have failed to invest in housing. And what is happening today in this hearing is part of what always happens, which is the federal government blames the states blame the counties blame the localities, and then back up the chain we go. How many times have you seen this movie? Raise your hand if you've seen this movie on housing. This isn't the answer. Housing, nothing is more determinative of a family's well-being financially, in terms of their health, in terms of their physical safety, in terms of their kids' educational opportunity, in terms of their retirement, than housing. And what we want to do today is try to figure out who to blame. What it means to me to be a leader is to step up and own the very biggest problem that American families are facing. And today, across the country, not just in California, although certainly there too, it's housing. So tell me, Ms. Lopez, what could we do if we actually passed the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act rather than doing a little? What would that full bill do if we passed that?
Thank you, Representative Porter. Great cue up. we could build $200,000 homes in partnership with local and state government. Local and state governments are working every day to find resources.
Sorry, Ms. Lopez, just to clarify.
Oh, yes.
The full Affordable Housing Improvement Act, we're only doing a part of it in this tax package,
Oh.
right?
You might have to give me that answer. I actually don't have that off the top of my head.
Well, so these credits, the
Yep.
bump, the 12.5%,
Yep.
are these permanent? No, they're temporary.
thank you.
They're temporary, right? So
Yep.
we're doing the right thing, but only for a little bit of time. That's why we're only going to get 200,000 houses out of this.
Thank you.
You
Yes.
see the desperation that your clients face battling each other over who's going to get these homes.
Exactly.
It took us 2 generations of failure of investment to get to this situation. We're not going to get out of it with 200,000 homes. And by the way, we're not going to get out of it with only federal government action. It is going to take states. It is going to take counties. But they need to be all in engaging here, not tinkering at the margins. So look, for people at home, I think it is so often the case in Washington that we can say, well, this is Republicans' fault. My Democratic colleagues do this. Democrats blame Republicans. The Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act, the full bill, do you know how many Democrats and Republicans sponsor that in the House by chance?
I don't, but I know it's the most popular bill, and that's enough for me.
I have the exact numbers for you.
Thank you. Thank you.
104 Democratic co-sponsors. You think we have like a Republican who'll sign on? No. We've got 103 Republican co-sponsors. So in a body where I am hard-pressed sometimes to find a single member who will agree, we've got 104 Democrats and 103 Republicans. But this bill hasn't been on the floor. We haven't voted on it. In my 5 years in Congress, we have taken 2,686 votes, not one of them to pass the most effective federal policy we have on housing. I yield back.
Senator Klobuchar.
Thank you. Ms. Lopez, I was just out in rural Minnesota last Friday, bunch of towns, housing, one of the number one things. Could you talk about the workforce shortage? It's part of why I have worked so much on apprenticeships and also on immigration reform with the potential for visas, work permits, whatever we can do to get there, as well as path to citizenship, how that would be helpful.
Thank you so much. Yes, and I'm a huge fan of your work in Minnesota. And we get calls weekly, monthly from developers saying, okay, I'm coming to this part of the state. Tell me who to work for. How do I find my contractors? Can you give me some leads? It's a constant issue. So we absolutely have to pair all of this work with building the workforce on the ground. There's best practices all over the country. It's usually our community colleges, it's our trade skills. So I think we can all agree that there's a win-win there. Modulars is a good solution. You still need people to lay the groundwork and build those modular components in a factory, so that is never going to be the solution. So workforce, we need it. And it's really difficult in rural areas. Some of our developers literally travel with their construction teams in order to take on jobs. So it's a big challenge.
Very hard.
Yep.
No great nation has expanded with the shrinking workforce. We can try to be the first experiment, but I don't think we should. Mr. Peter, you were a foreign exchange student to one of my favorite mayors, is that correct? Excellent.
That's correct.
And you've kept up contact with him, which I now know by text. Could you talk about, you've talked about in the past increasing density, the value of doing it along transit corridors. We are trying to do a lot in Minneapolis on this front. You have to get zoning changes. This is local, things like that. Could you talk about the value of that?
Sure. So Minneapolis already passed some reforms a couple of years ago and to great fanfare. Unfortunately, I don't think Minneapolis did it right, and St. Paul now has followed suit. I don't think they did it right either.
So how do you think we should do it right?
So they basically in their zoning code, they removed the word single family and replaced it with duplex and triplex. But they did not change the floor area ratio that goes along with it.
I see.
So if you have a lot of 6,000 square feet and the floor area ratio is the maximum is 50%, you can build a structure of 3,000 square feet. But with 3,000 square feet, it's hard to build a triplex, for example, which each unit will only be 1,000 square feet. So in conjunction, it's not just enough to get rid of single-family detached zoning. You also need to put in place other reforms like parking reforms, like higher flow area
Right.
ratio requirements. So it needs to be looked at holistically. And at the same time, I don't think you necessarily look at transit corridors is the right solution either. I think if you make it more broad-based, you can get multiple benefits. If you only do a transit, you're going to get very expensive housing, and you're going to get mostly rental housing. If you do it more broad-based, where you allow townhouses, for example, these townhouses overwhelmingly tend to be owner-occupied. So you can increase homeownership, and you can open up opportunities for people to build wealth, because when they're homeowners, they're going to pay down their mortgage. And also these townhouses are larger, so they're more family-friendly, versus in the transit corridors, you only get on average about a bedroom, versus over here, with what we call light touch density, you get 2-3 bedrooms, which is more beneficial to families.
Thank you. Dr. Schutz, if we could talk about algorithm, always fun, and what is going on right now with pricing tools that collect highly sensitive data from landlords. Senator Lee and I had a major hearing on this. We've done a lot on tech. And so could you talk about pricing tools and what could occur with price increases? And we're very concerned, a number of us, Democrats, Republicans, of just beyond housing, just what's going on with potential price fixing through people using other outside companies that then get hooked into algorithms that actually result in price fixing. Go ahead.
Sure, thank you. We've seen in the last couple of years increasing use of these outside platforms who manage the rent rolls for a large number of properties across different landlords. And they are collecting data because they collect data on the vacancy rates and on the rents and what the rents look like at turnover, and are sharing that potentially across multiple companies. I will say this is an area that's still quite new, and the data is mostly proprietary, so it's very hard to know what's going on. So this is an area where I feel like there's a lot to be learned still, and having more transparency in the data, in what they're collecting and how it's being used. Some of this is really beneficial. So for instance, they're providing data that supplements the CPI rent index, that provides more frequent updates. But this is just an area where I think knowing more about what's going on inside the black box would be very beneficial.
Very good. Thank you.
Senator Fetterman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And what a jackpot. My colleague from Minnesota and Representative Porter, and I was even hoping that there'd be a whiteboard here to take it on. And the nicest dude in DC right there, my colleague from Vermont. So I'm grateful for the opportunity. And now, homelessness is, it's really an issue. I think we can all agree on that. It's been me talking about that. And it's a crisis. And so, Dr. Schutz, you've all outlined about the decay of existing homes contributes to the housing shortage, right? You know, and we can't increase the supply if we are losing existing homes. Do we agree with that? And certainly as fast as we can build it. And now I know that you're very familiar with the Whole Homes Repair program, right? Now I want to net check Senator Nikhil Saval in Pennsylvania. And he was my former colleague in Pennsylvania, and he is a senator. And now that's the brain of his. And he came up with this. And Senator Saval is very, very left, politically. And the Republican senators in our Senate are very, very right. But somehow they put this remarkable thing together. And it's an amazing thing. And, can you talk about that program? And do you think that could be even a national model?
Yeah, we haven't talked much today about the quality and age of the existing stock, but that's a very close corollary with the lack of available homes. A lot of our homes are aging, they are not in great quality, and historically we haven't really provided programs and incentives or subsidies for people to maintain the quality of homes. So every year some of the lowest cost homes fall out of usability because they are so old and they become unsafe, or they become ripe for being bought and gut rehabbed and then become expensive. So maintaining the quality and habitability of existing older homes is really important. We have limited programs. The Department of Energy's Weatherization Assistance Program is the main one, and that only serves very targeted kinds of needs. So my understanding is that the Whole Home Repairs Program would provide more holistic funding, not just for things like weatherization and energy efficiency, but also for major repairs and for climate resilience. So that would enable both homeowners and landlords of properties that serve low-income tenants to maintain the house in better condition. And that's a really important part because once those units are lost, we never get them back.
Yeah, and I would just like to remind that a first-term, very, very left state senator created this working with very, very conservative Republican members of the Senate, and both sides were excited about this. I mean, that's a unicorn as far as I know. I've been around long enough to know that. And I really would love to see that expand on a national level because it addresses a very significant issue, especially in states like mine in Pennsylvania. Now, pivoting over to this idea that, do you agree with this statement that there's just way too much red tape and zoning, and it really seems much too expensive that to build these kind of homes? Can we make this more cost effective? And I'm not suggesting that we not use union kinds of work, but it just seems like it's got to be able to make that work to the problem. Or anyone, I'm sorry.
Yes, yes, and I think it's a good reminder that we want to look across the range of regulations. So we've been talking a lot today about zoning, but we also want to look at things like building codes, at some of the environmental reviews, which unfortunately in states like California often gets weaponized to block programs. So just making sure that the regulations that are in place are about health and safety and not just about creating process and making it longer and more difficult to build.
Yeah, I think to your average person would be like, why does it take so expensive when we have such a real problem of homelessness here? I think we should just arrive where we can address it and not make it any less safe and just make it more efficient and make it more cost effective. I just have to believe there has to be an answer. And lastly, what kind of policy should we be tying to land use reform so these communities are the ones that are left behind?
So
Not picking on you, but whatever.
Sure. The affordability problem is hardest in places that have often very well-paid jobs, but it's also worth thinking about places where housing is affordable, but don't necessarily have economic opportunity. And one of the hopes of sort of broad-based zoning reform, as Tobias was saying, is that opening up the ability to build more homes in communities that have good jobs and have access to transit and good public schools enables more economic mobility and more opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Walsh.
Thank you very much. Dr. Fury, anytime you want to come here and brag about Vermont, I hope you'll be invited. You're certainly welcome. Appreciate that. Just a couple of things. One, there seems to be real consensus that the zoning, the local steps that can be taken only locally on zoning, regulatory review, there's a lot of action around the country on that, and Vermont certainly is doing it. But there's a couple of things we haven't talked about that have become factors, and I'd like to get your opinion on it. In Vermont, after COVID, a couple of things happened. Number one, the enormous number of people from out of Vermont came and bought a second home. And those are effectively beyond reach now for local folks. Number two, a number of investors came to Vermont, bought up homes and turned them into Airbnbs. And those are now off the books. And as much as we're aggressively doing all we can to build new affordable housing in dealing with local regulations, it takes a longer time in order to do that. And we've got a real crisis. If you've got workers in ski areas, they live an hour and a half away. There's no chance that they can get a good place to live, where when I first went to Vermont, that was not a problem. But the third problem that is enormous is workforce. We just don't have the folks that are the electricians and the plumbers and the roofers and the drywall folks. That is a huge problem. And then really finally, on the market, if you're a contractor, you make a lot more money buying or building a pretty luxury second home as opposed to affordable housing. And we haven't really talked about those factors that are a real dynamic that I suspect affects not just Vermont, but I'll bet a lot of other places as well. I'll start with you, Ms. Lopez. What about those factors and what do we do?
Just one comment on that. Thank you. Thinking about the second home, it's all over the territories and states I work. And so the ways that we're kind of tackling this is we're thinking about taxing those second homes so we can create funds to offset the impacts, the real impacts. The other thing we're doing is when we can get accessory dwelling units for the workforce, not only is it a change in zoning, it requires financing so that you can help that home buyer provide that ADU, and then you want to have local residency requirements. So that's that piece. Ask your question.
Well, that's also
Yeah.
happening, by the
Yep.
way, like with hospitals, when they want to get workforce.
Yep.
Or, employers can't hire somebody because they offer
Really?
someone a really good job. They really want to come to Vermont. And one of the partners comes and is unable to
Absolutely.
find a place to live.
Absolutely. We're seeing a lot of interest in employers stepping in to help solve these issues, but I'm going to hand the workforce off to others
Okay.
because that's not my expertise. Thank you.
Yeah, it's come up a couple of times today that we don't have enough construction workers, and that's a real problem. Some of that goes back to the Great Recession. People who would have gone into construction trades as apprentices didn't because there weren't construction jobs. We also had a slowdown in immigration, and that's one of the main sources of the construction workforce. The construction industry knows this, the home builders know this, but a push to get more kids in high school and people who are out of school and maybe a little bit older to retrain. Construction jobs are really well paid, and if you're an electrician or a plumber, you're never going to not have a job. And so getting more people into these fields, getting them trained would help us provide good jobs for people
Okay.
and would also help us build more homes.
Mr. Peter wants to say something. By the way, this is an area where, I know you put a lot of faith in the market, but this is where, in terms of the market meeting the needs of everyday people, I do believe it's a total market failure for a lot of reasons, but the market won't solve it, as I see it. But go ahead.
Yeah, let me just give you an example from Montana, because I just heard the governor of Montana speak on this workforce issue, and they have massive problems out in
Right.
Montana. But what they're doing is educational reimbursement credits for these trade jobs. The second thing that he mentioned is they looked at the amount of tradesmen, the ratio of tradesmen to apprentices. And in the old days, it was that you had 2 tradesmen for 1 apprentice. So now they flipped the ratio from now it only takes 1 tradesman for 2 apprentices. So over time, they're going to get a lot more tradesmen through these small regulatory changes. And then the third thing that they've done out in Montana is they've attracted a modular home builder. Mm-hmm. And they have people that can pour the concrete even in more rural areas, but they didn't have the people to build the home, so hence the modular housing coming in, and they can assemble it on site, put a little bit of the plumbing, the electricity in, they can cross-train people, but that seems to be working in Montana.
Yeah, thank you. My time is up, so I'm not going to be able to hear from you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Vice Chairman, do you want to leave us with your closing thoughts?
Couple things. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to actually throw a couple articles into the record just for reference.
Without objection?
Mr. Chairman, thank you for doing this. The reality, we could all be, well, a couple of you already have done your PhD thesis on this, on just portions of this. We have to deal with the reality of the demographic changes, migration, and we also, something we've been trying to have a conversation with the Joint Economic Republican economists is, are we making policy that's prepared for the technology disruptions that are coming? What will jobs look like in a few years? And I hate to use the pop culture words, but whether it be AI, whether it be other types of technology, whether it be just the fact of the aging of America. We've seen some things in Arizona where a lot of our tradesmen retired. And the next generation, there wasn't that pipeline, and yet you look at the demographics. So thank you for doing this hearing. There's a lot for us to understand, and then there is one last request I have. I would, because it came up 2 times in the opening statements, what federal land if there's ever a researcher map, if any of you know it, that would be available, particularly around urban or smaller communities, that would make a rational way to trade into development or actually have the federal government sell. Because for many of us in the West, we have sort of leapfrogging type development. And then often that leapfrogging, the infrastructure cost is one of the drivers of why that underlying real estate's so expensive. And just from basic urban planning, it's an irrational way to do it. And so I'm trying to think of the things we can do policy-wise as members of the federal side that don't necessarily rely on additional subsidies, but actually would rely on better policy. And with that, I yield back.
Well, I want to thank everyone who participated today. Certainly, my colleagues are incredible witnesses. One of the things that is always interesting out of these hearings is that you really do get some ideas for where there is some common ground. And there are always things that we disagree on. But I have to say, I was really surprised that all four of our witnesses today agreed, having some scars myself from my days as land use chair in the Albuquerque City Council, that reforming exclusionary zoning is a key part of this and works. I think that's a great lesson. The emphasis across the board on the dais here on apprenticeships also really interesting. We clearly need to make that workforce match up to the demands that we have today. And then this idea of tax treatment between investors versus actual homeowners is something, a question worth diving into. So I want to thank everyone. Any additional questions for the record may be submitted after the hearing, and the record will remain open for 3 business days. The hearing is now adjourned.